Hello, I hope everyone's doing well. My name is Ryan Sharpe, and today I'm going to present to you my term project about forming the American dream through literature. We're going to kind of go over some of the authors uh, present in the earlier times of American history, kind of some various genres, and kind of go from there. So, without further ado, let's get started. All right, so to kind of start off, really, after the end of the Revolutionary War, uh, America as a country was kind of culturally a blank slate for new literature and ideas and creativity to kind of flourish. There really wasn't. Um, Obviously, there was culture that had been brought over from Great Britain, but the American people really, after that war, kind of wanted to differentiate themselves in a way from their predecessors. Gordon Wood, in his book, The Radicalism of the American Revolution, stated that Americans had become almost overnight the most liberal, democratic, commercially minded, and most modern people in the world, uh, not only radically changing the personal and social relations of the people, but also destroying aristocracy as it had been understood in the Western world for at least 2 millennia. So, really, the revolution was kind of a breaking point and a turning point in the world history as it is known, uh, culturally, for all sorts of things, literature included. Um, so when we have this blank slate kind of created and laid out, a new nation established with the ideas of freedom and all sorts of other uh, new ideas brought about, it kind of sets in motion the ability for new authors to come on the scene and start creating. And we see that early on in American poetry through two very prominent authors during this time, uh, both Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. So these are both very well known poets who wrote some really astounding works for their time. And Whitman was kind of known for simplistic works. He wasn't really known for writing advanced material per se. It's very easy reading stuff, um, and it's very open in its purpose for what it's trying to communicate to the reader. Um, a lot of his works were kind of seemed a little bit off the wall, kind of out there a little bit, considered by many. He was kind of criticized a little bit early on, but his works have kind of gained more and more popularity as time has progressed. Um, Particularly in one work of his known as Song of Myself, he's very seems very selfish, but really it's more about the kind of encouragement of the American people to embrace themselves and each other and kind of embrace that new American dream. I think Walt Whitman is probably a great example of physically putting the American dream into words. In a way, if you read a lot of his works, he's kind of the author that kind of sets it in motion. Emily Dickinson, obviously another very prominent poet in her time. She actually didn't rise to prominence during her lifetime. She actually rose to prominence afterwards, uh, due to most of her works being published after her passing by her family. I believe the books are called like Poems by Emily Dickinson, and so it's very interesting poems. The big thing with Emily Dickinson is death. She talks a lot about death, um, and she not really physically as death, but she uses death as kind of an idea to kind of personify, I guess, or kind of metaphorically link her messages and themes in a way. For example, like in one of her poems known as I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died, she's really using death as kind of a point, as like a reflection. It's really not like some kind of death per se. It's more kind of like a reflection on her life. And yes, death is coming, but it's kind of those final moments before that. It kind of brings that into light. Very well known poet. Her works are also very relatable, it seems, when you read them. It's very relatable to common life situations that go on. And they're a little bit more advanced too. Some reading between the lines is required with her works, but nevertheless, very great poetry by both of these authors. Moving on, Mark Twain, I would say, is definitely the most well known, arguably, author in American history. He really kind of changed the course of how poems, or, well, excuse me, not poems, but fiction was written uh, kind of up until his point. His real name is Samuel Clemens, and he kind of changed his name through pen to Mark Twain. There's a story behind it. I'm not entirely sure what it is. I had looked it up, but it's not coming to mind. Um, but the big thing with Mark Twain is he really kind of changed the direction of literature, and he kind of cemented in that American dream idea through his writings. Twain's work is very advanced writing. It's very strong writing. He wrote all sorts of works, mostly novels, like Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer, Pudd'nhead Wilson. These are all just a few of his many different works that were very important. He used a lot of literary techniques in his writing to kind of bring life. In my view, it's kind of through setting, really. So, in a lot of his works, you'll see dialect, vernacular, kind of this very uh, culturally defined literature. When he quotes people in his stories, he uses the way they would speak in real life. He writes that into writing. Uh, it's not like he just, in most literature you see people kind of write proper. In this, it's very dialectual. It's very uh, the way it's spoken in a way, and it kind of gives life to the story that way. Kind of helps you understand the location, the local color of the place he's writing about. Many of his novels are kind of written and set around the Mississippi River area, especially Pudd'nhead Wilson. And you kind of see that a lot in his writing. Another thing you see a lot of in his writing, to kind of, and this is kind of the way he communicates his themes throughout his story, is the use of irony and satire. So obviously, Mark Twain was known to kind of be a rule breaker. He was very high on humor, um, had a lot of character in his writing, um, and really, there's a lot of satire and humor that you can see in his writing, but he really uses that to communicate messages to his readers. For example, in Pudd'nhead Wilson, that's one we were required to read kind of in the course this year. You kind of see that through the main characters, it kind of ends up being kind of an ironic situation when the slave's son ends up being uh, switched out with the actual slave owner's son, and I believe her name was Roxy. And you kind of see that kind of turn out bad and poorly in the end. It didn't really work out the way that she had intended for it. And it really kind of brings the conversation of morality into play. It really kind of brings that kind of conversation of what's really was the best thing to do in that situation. And obviously, um, I think reading our discussions this year, it's kind of true that I think morality kind of depends on the situation you're in. If it's a situation that's kind of more geared towards the necessity for shelter or life-giving items, then maybe there's some wiggle room there. But in a regular sense, maybe morality should be upheld. But that's just kind of the one of many different ideas presented there, and kind of an example of how he presents that idea in Pudd'nhead Wilson. Mark Twain, probably one of the most well-known authors in American history. Finally, we'll talk about two very prominent leaders in the civil rights movement uh, after the end of slavery, at the end of the Civil War. It really kind of started the rise to prominence for culture in the African American sector of the American population, and it really the fight that they had to gain the independence and true freedom and equality that they really deserved from the beginning. Um, so these are two prominent authors and political leaders of that era. Booker T. Washington, he was an early leader. He was a slave himself. So when he was freed, obviously he had the experience of being a slave. He kind of knew the hardships that people of that culture faced. Um, and that really kind of gave him an idea of what to what his people might need. Um, he went to school. I can't recall exactly what the college he went to was, but he did go to college. And that experience in school kind of gave him the catalyst for his belief in the idea of education trumping all other aspects, really. He believed that education was very necessary to have a strong and educated workforce, and that in turn resulted in him willing to give up sacrifices uh, to white people and people of other cultures. For example, segregation. He actually, I believe, uh, was known to be an advocate for segregation if it meant getting an education. Uh, so he really kind of saw those sacrifices and made those in order to gain what he thought was most important. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, you have W.E.B. Du Bois, who rose to prominence shortly after Washington. But he was a Harvard graduate, and he grew up in the North. He didn't have the experience of being a slave, but he knew that there was an importance in total equality between all races, not just making sacrifices or, you know, giving things up in order to gain one thing, per se. He really saw that there needed to be equality, no segregation. Uh, you know, it was a coexisting society, uh, not a society that was separate, but together. Um, and he was kind of an early figure that rose up to preach these ideas and all that in the civil rights movement. So both of these authors, obviously, when you tie it to the American dream, their American dream was kind of different from everyone else's. It was kind of their dream was to live the same lives as everyone else, and they, through much hard work and dedication, they did eventually achieve that, thankfully. So, in conclusion, so through different means, each of these authors produced and furthered the idea of the American dream in their own unique way. Without the contributions of each of these people, history would definitely not be the same, and arguably the American dream would be something much different than we know it today. Kind of recapping each author, Whitman defined the dream of through poetry outright. He kind of outright described it. Dickinson pursued it through her unique and expressive poetry. Mark Twain reformed the modern literature by popularizing novel and fiction writing and by using techniques that had never been used by writers before. His dream was to be different and to use his freedom to expand in creativity. And finally, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois pursued their dream of freedom and equality for all people through their writings and speeches. Um, so, Here's the one work I did use for this presentation. That will conclude my term presentation on the American Dream. Hopefully, I was able to kind of bring to light some of the ideas I had in my term paper, and I think that it's definitely a very interesting study, the work of American literature, and how it kind of changed and kind of guided the people of this country up until the point that we're at now. It's a really great reflection. So, with that, thank you for watching and have a wonderful day. Thank you.